Hello and welcome to the Labor Drawn podcast. This is Gabe, and I'm not going to try to come up with a clever intro. But this is a recording of our presentation, Something Radical Happened Here, Philadelphia's Radical Jews, done in partnership with the Philadelphia Jewish Labor Bund in March 2025. Longtime listeners might recognize this from a presentation we did for the Philadelphia Jewish Children's Folkschule back in 2023, but we updated the slides a bit, added new information, and trimmed it down slightly. Unfortunately, due to tech issues on our end, we lost the audio from Sam in the audience, so you'll just have to deal with me ranting for about 45 minutes. If you happen to have any complaints about this recording, please send them in letter form via express mail to the Complaints Department of the Soldiers and Sailors Workmen's Council at 232 North 9th Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Thank you, and enjoy.
This will be just a smattering of about 60 or 70 years worth of history. So there's a lot more that can be said about every single one of these topics, and we're also skipping over a lot. To start, we need to do a little bit of leftist Jewish math so that we have an understanding of what we're talking about here. So, as we all know, you have two Jews, which is three opinions. This can be expressed as J sub 1 times J sub 2 equals three opinions. Additionally, you have L sub 1 times L sub 2, which is one leftist and another leftist. You'll end up with three opinions. Now, when you have two Jewish leftists, you'd think it would still only be three opinions, but really this has to be expressed as J sub 1 times L sub 1 times J sub 2 times L sub 2, which will give you at least 9 opinions. Scientifically, we have yet to discover the maximum number of opinions that can be had when two Jewish leftists discuss anything. And over here, although it's a little bit faded, we have a variety of Jewish labor figures throughout history. So starting here, we have Sam Gompers, one of the founding members of the American Federation of Labor, kind of long-time conservative unionist, had a variety of political opinions. Then we have David Dubinsky, president of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union from the 30s through to the 50s, if I remember correctly. Up here, can't really see him too well, but this is Benjamin Gold, who was a communist-aligned leader in the International Fur and Leather Workers Union. Down here, we have Clara Lemlech, who was a rank-and-file member of the ILGWU, and she basically started the uprising of the 20,000 in 1909. At the bottom, we have David Edelstadt. He's a Jewish anarchist, a poet, a writer, a composer as well, if I remember correctly, and one of the early Yiddish anarchist theorists. And then, of course, your girl, Emma Goldman. I really hope I don't need to explain Emma Goldman. But now we're going to get into Jewish Philadelphia. So initially, there weren't a lot of Jews in Philadelphia because this was all Lenape land. But starting in the late 17th century, early 18th century, you had some mostly Sephardic Jewish immigration coming over from Europe, mostly from the lowlands in the Netherlands. So these were Jews that had fled Spanish Jews that had fled the Inquisition to the then Spanish Netherlands, then sought economic opportunities in the New World and came over. And because Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn and the Quakers, they had religious tolerance, so it was one of the few places in North America where Jews could settle. Then we also have families like the Gratz. This is Rebecca Gratz over here. And she was one of the first, or the Gratz family was one of the first German Jewish families to come over. They represented, German Jews then represented the majority of Jewish immigration throughout the rest of the 18th and into the beginning of the 19th century. They also all tended to be much wealthier and came over because there was a lot of opportunity for the merchant trade. So that's Jewish immigration to Philly up and through most of the 19th century until you get to 1881, when Tsar Alexander II gets assassinated, and then we get blamed for it. And then a bunch of poor Jews come over from Eastern Europe all of a sudden and start bringing their fun Eastern European politics, bringing Yiddish with them. And the established German and Sephardic Jews that were already here really did not like this, because they viewed the unwashed masses of Yids coming over as a threat to their own social standing, because they were being associated with these radical working class Jews that had come over, whereas they needed to maintain some level of assimilation and acceptability within white Christian society in order to maintain their economic ties. That will come up again later. All right, so now some of the first examples of radical organizing that we got in Philly was actually from the anarchist movement. If anyone knows about Jewish radicalism writ large in the US, you'll know New York was really a center of social democracy and early socialism. Philly, in contrast, because we have to be different, was very anarchist from the very beginning. So you had a lot of different anarchist reading groups that popped up. One was called the Knights of Liberty. They were mostly a reading group and also did some cultural events. They really liked putting on anarchist, or not anarchist satyrs. They would have a Yom Kippur ball. So while everyone else was fasting on Yom Kippur, they would have giant banquets and throw these massive balls, basically as a way to show their disregard for religion. Then a number of anarchists from New York came down and helped them found something called the Pioneers of Liberty in Philly. And these were more interested in actually going out and talking to workers. So rather than just meeting in a reading group in someone's basement and reading theory, they went out and said, hey, you should go and talk to the working classes and try and educate them and encourage them towards some radical action. And that's when an anarchist communist, so they weren't quite abbreviating anarcho-communist yet, started to develop in Philly. And one of these guys, really can't see his picture very well, but Max Staller was one of these, one of the members of the Pioneers of Liberty. He had also been a member of the Knights of Liberty. He went out with a few other members and started organizing cloak makers in the city. Then on May 1st, 1890, there was a May Day parade among cloak makers up in New York City. The New York bosses responded to that by calling for a lockout. The cloak makers in New York then declared a strike. Then the cloak makers in Philadelphia realized that they were going to be used as scab labor to fill the contracts for all the companies in New York that either had a strike or a lockout. So then on May 10th, Max Staller and the Cloak Makers Union Local Number 1 of the Jewish Federation of Labor, which was a specifically Jewish labor federation that they basically just created as part of this strike, marched out. By May 14th, they had 250 members, or 250 workers out on strike, mostly from Bloom Brothers, which was actually right on Market Street. I think at Market and 12th was the main Bloom Brothers store. Then they had factories and other areas around the city. So primary demand was recognition of the union. And Staller then threatened to call a general strike of all cloak makers in the city if they didn't concede to the demands. bosses responded to that by saying, we'll establish a general lockout of anyone who even says the word union in the whole city. So the strike dragged on for a while, but there were a couple dramatic moments that are worth highlighting. So one meeting at the Wheatley Dramatic Hall at 5th and Gaskell, Staller and others were giving speeches. While Staller was giving a speech, the police called in reinforcements, which caused another anarchist present by the name of H.F. Gordon to come up on stage and call out, "The police are our enemies. Stand together and I tell you the truth when I say that we will wash our hands in the blood of the tyrants." The police didn't like that. So they responded to that by storming the meeting. And Staller was forced to jump out of a window to escape them. He was then found a couple days later working at a cigar factory and then got arrested. Then on August 25th, the Reverend R.W. Christian of the Shiloh Baptist Church was brought in to oversee a workhouse of 180 black women to be trained as cloakmakers to break the strike. This is, as anyone that knows labor history, is a very common tactic where you take two marginalized communities and pit them against each other. Unfortunately, Staller and the rest of the cloakmakers didn't seem to have any interest in showing labor solidarity with any of the black women. Basically, Staller said that there's no way that they can be as good of a cloakmaker as any of us can. And he just said they're welcome to try. And then continued about his strike and didn't try to organize with them at all. Strike lasted until the end of August in 1890, when the only concession they were able to win was rehiring of all of the strikers. So that was one of the first examples of labor radicalism in Philly's Jewish community. Now we're going to go on to the Tuttleman brothers and Fagin. This was, I don't know how well you can see it, but this is their current store. That's up on Front Street. I believe it's 225 North Front Street. That was one of their major manufacturing places. They also had one down at 8th and Snyder Ave. So they were primarily a shirtwaist, shirt, and collar company. And their workers went out on strike in 1906. And almost immediately, the Jewish owners of Tuttleman Brothers and Fagin put out a newspaper, or put out an editorial in the English language newspapers stating that the reason for the strike was that Jewish workers refused to work next to Gentile workers. They had also brought in a lot of non-Jewish scabs to replace all of their striking workers, which the union expected scabs to be brought in. For the most part, at this point, when Jewish workers were striking against Jewish bosses, the Jewish bosses would bring in new or newly arrived Jewish immigrants to replace the striking Jewish workers. That was just kind of the accepted way to do it. So when they brought in non-Jewish scabs, that threw off the union, and then they published this editorial saying that the union didn't want to work, or the Jewish workers didn't want to work with Gentiles. Now, the rest of the non-Jewish community in Philly read that editorial, and then immediately decided, okay, we're going to go attack some Jews. And this led to anti-Semitic attacks all around the city, to the point where even the wealthier and liberal elements of the Jewish community came together with the socialist and more radical sides and published a condemnation of Tuttleman Brothers and Fagin for this, demanding that they issue a retraction. It took, if I remember correctly, about a month or so before Tuttleman and Fagin even admitted that they wrote the editorial in the first place, and then finally issued a retraction. But even though you had that communal solidarity, while all of that was going on and the wealthier parts of the Jewish community were theoretically defending the strikers, they also published an op-ed in the Jewish Exponent saying, "We have no means of determining whether their alleged grievances existed in fact." This is talking about the workers going out on strike. "Or if they were merely unreasonable demands without merit or substantial basis." So while they were going out there to theoretically help defend all of these Jewish workers from the threat of a potential pogrom, at the same time, they were also saying, like, yeah, but don't listen to any of their actual labor demands. Just don't attack them for being Jewish. The strike pretty much ended in failure, mostly because the ILGWU up in New York refused to support any of the striking workers down in Philly, to the point where at the next general meeting of the ILGWU, the delegation from Philly demanded that the New York body completely dissolve itself because, as they said, they weren't doing anything. So there's long-lasting animosity between Philly's ILGWU and the New York locals. Now we'll get on to the Girl Army. This is another strike that started up in New York City. In 1909, Clara Lemlech basically called out a demand for a strike at an ILGWU meeting, which prompted the uprising of the 20,000, which was effectively a general strike among the shirtwaist industry in New York. In Philly, they recognized that they were being used as scab labor to fill in for the contracts up in New York. And between 7,000 and 10,000, mostly very young Jewish women marched out. For the most part, they were aged 14 to their mid-20s. You can't really see it too much on screen here, but from left to right, we have Lizzie Velga, 14 years old, Fanny Katz, 12 years old, Fanny Bonish, 12 years old, and Sadie Gorak, 12 years old. In this strike, we also had Bessie Hyman, who was 15 years old at the time and the president of the Marker and Cleaners Union. She got herself hired at Haber and Company, which was one of the most virulently anti-union shops in the city at the time, and one of the only ones that was continuing to operate during the strike. She spent the next few days trying to organize the strikebreakers there, convince them to come out and join the pickets. She was then found out by the bosses and physically dragged out of the factory, basically kicking and screaming the whole time. So there were also some attempts by middle class and wealthier Jewish women to support the strikers, but for the most part, they demanded that if they wanted, or the wealthier women were demanding that if the strikers wanted their support, they needed to tone down the violence and behave better. And the strikers effectively responded to that by saying, you can give us your money to support our strike fund, but aside from that, you can kind of go fuck yourself. And we're not going to listen to you. Because they knew how to organize themselves. So that strike didn't end in broad union recognition. They did get some concessions from the bosses in terms of conditions, but their primary goal was recognition, which unfortunately they weren't able to succeed. In part, again, because there wasn't a lot of support between the Philadelphia, New York, and at this point, Boston and Baltimore locals. All right, we're going to skip ahead a little bit more to the 1917 kosher food riots. To cut a very long story short, there was a strike at the sugar refineries down in South Philly. This strike was actually led by the IWW. And a fair chunk of the men on strike at those factories were Jewish. Then, at the same time, there was a really just horrible inflation, especially among the ingredients for gefilte fish. A lot of the specific complaints were on the prices of fish, onions and potatoes. So the normal Jewish diet. And so in response to that, because this inflation was nationwide, up in New York City, the women organized a march onto New York City Hall. Down in Philly, basically there were two divergent methods that they were that folks decided to use. One was led by wealthier middle-class women from up around Kensington, and they organized a large petition to be sent to, I believe, the governor at the time. That was led by Mrs. Monroe, who was a philanthropist and had tried to alleviate some of the issues among the Yiddish-speaking women up in Kensington. Now, down in South Philly, they took some more of a direct action approach. On February 22nd, which was the same night that Mrs. Monroe sent the letter, women of South Philly stormed food vendors at 7th and Morris Street, yelling that the prices were robbery. They attacked butcher shops, actually doused one butcher shop in kerosene and threatened to light it on fire. They then met at the synagogue at 6th and Siegel Streets and basically declared that they were going to go on a food strike and refuse to purchase anything from vendors that charged high prices, and would also continue to enforce that through fairly violent direct action. Then, after a couple of days of that, eventually a state probe was actually created to look into the high cost of food. The state probe looked into it and said, yes, food prices are high. And then the United States entered World War I, and basically a massive amount of federal funding came in for food production for the war effort, which then also led to a certain amount of food rationing. But that also meant that you had a guaranteed amount of food coming to you every day. So weirdly, World War I kind of solved that problem. One of the few problems World War I solved. But it's still a kind of fascinating little piece of South Philly Jewish life. So now we'll get to labor lyceums and kind of the radical community that existed in Philly. Because right now we've been focusing mostly on strikes and actions, but these are some of the organizations that existed in the city and really made up a lot of Jewish life. So first off, we have labor lyceums, which are basically a meeting hall for workers. So the idea is to create a large community space that was owned by and operated by and for the working class. The ones in Philly came about from a really fascinating German socialist by the name of Friedrich Wilhelm Fritzsche, who was everything from a German or a socialist politician in Germany under Bismarck, to a bartender in Philly and a newspaper owner and editor as well. So he's a very interesting character, and he came up with the idea of establishing a labor lyceum at a large May Day picnic in the 1880s. So initially they rented space at 441 North 5th Street. Then Congregation Knesset Israel left their old synagogue at 809 North 6th, and the Lyceum Association bought the old building and converted it into, you can't really see the picture terribly well, but converted it into the first Labor Lyceum Hall. And that served both as an example of or proof of concept for the theory, and also as one of the first really working class gathering sites in the city. And they would host rallies. They were used as organizing sites for strikes. They were also used as speaking halls. And because it wasn't controlled by any specific union or party, it was just basically an independent association. They had everyone speaking here from Sam Gompers to Emma Goldman. They had Mother Jones speaking at them, Eugene Debs. I believe Lucy Parsons spoke in Philly at least once. But basically, anyone that was even vaguely involved with workers' rights in the first quarter of the 20th century and in Philadelphia at any point probably spoke at one of the labor lyceums. Mother Jones actually led the March of the Mill Children in 1903, starting at the Kensington Labor Lyceum, marching all the way up to New York City. But in addition to the labor lyceums, which while they were very connected to both the Jewish and the German workers' movements in Philly, they were ostensibly for everyone. Now we'll move on to the Arbeiterring, or the Workers' Circle, or Workmen's Circle. At the time, they still exist. Now they're the Workers' Circle. And they were effectively an immigrant mutual aid society that then evolved into a kind of radical workers' movement within the Jewish world, still maintaining a lot of that, the basic mutual aid functions as well. So they had life insurance programs, health insurance, unemployment insurance. They had their own grave sites, and were basically a large support group for Jewish workers across the U.S. In Philly, they were founded, or the first ones that I've been able to identify showed up around 1904, which was the Gershuni branch. All of the branches in Philly were named for well-known Jewish leftists or socialists. So we had, and also Bundists. We had Vladimir Medem, Arkady Kremer, Morris Sigman. Later on, there was an Albert Einstein branch. They were also occasionally named for whatever shtetl the community that founded them were originally from. So you have like the Bialystok branch, the Rovna branch, the Odessa branch. Then they basically all operated semi-independently. They did have a large conference and delegate system, and that led after the Russian Revolution in 1917 and the impact that had on the American left, basically splitting the Socialist Party and creating the Communist Party. That also got reflected within the Arbeiterring, where there was a strong communist left faction within the Arbeiterring that started to try and both, depending on the time period, either pressure and take over the Arbeiterring or factionalize, break off, and create their own organization. And eventually they did create the International Workers' Order, which was effectively a workers' mutual aid system based on the Arbeiterring model, but for all workers. And any working class person could be a member. Like the Arbeiterring, it functioned as life insurance, health insurance, unemployment, and they would also host a lot of political and cultural events, and served as an educational organ as well, but all tied with the Communist Party, whereas the Arbeiterring at this point was very staunchly tied to the Socialist Party. Within the International Workers' Order, you also had 13 separate cultural organizations that each one served different ethnic communities within the U.S. within the Jewish community, you had the Jewish People's Fraternal Order of the International Workers' Order. And that was actually founded in Philly at 1216 Chestnut, if I remember the address correctly, which is just one of the random office buildings in Center City. But they have the original founding documents, I believe, up at Cornell, and you can see very clearly it was founded in Philly. And so JPF, or the Jewish People's Fraternal Order, and all of the other ethnic organizations within the International Workers' Order would do cultural events, both tied to left-wing educational programs, but within the cultural milieu of each one of those groups. So like JPFO would put on Yiddish theater programs, do Yiddish songs, and did a lot on discussing the advancements of Jews within the Soviet Union, which at the same time the Arbiter Ring was constantly organizing about the plight of Jews in the Soviet Union. So you have both of these organizations constantly at odds with each other, because again, two Jews and a million opinions. That's going to lead us in to kind of life in Philly in the 1930s. So stock market crashed in 1929, Great Depression. 1933, FDR gets elected, which then brings in kind of the New Deal era, which was both coming from, depending on the program, was coming from his administration. A lot of it was also pretty much in direct response to pressure from the ground. So throughout the 1920s and into the 30s, there was a lot of left-wing organizing that was making a lot of demands. And then once the Great Depression hit, they were able to bring a lot more people into the fold and very strongly make some demands, to the point where you had, there's one letter from a farmer in the Midwest who, writing a letter to Roosevelt, basically said that the Depression has convinced him that revolutionary communism is the only solution, and that he's going to dedicate the rest of his life to that. So if you can get a... back in the day when you could just write letters to the president. And so as part of that, I don't know how well you can see, but this is a May Day rally out front of City Hall in 1935, hosted by the Communist Party, that, according to the Communist Party, there were 10,000 people there. Take that with however big a grain of salt as you want. There were also, once the Spanish Civil War kicked off in 36, there was a lot of organizing in Philly to support aid to Spain. A lot of the various Jewish-led unions around the city were organizing food and clothing, or supplies and clothing drives. There were a number of Jewish members of the Communist Party that went and served in the international brigades to fight alongside the Republican forces in Spain against Franco. Then back at home, the New Deal programs, specifically the National Labor Relations Act, which kind of the National Industrial Recovery Act, or the NRA, first allowed for the existence of unions on a semi-legal basis, to the point where it was effectively just one line in the entire act that said that companies will not prevent the organization of workers into recognized bodies. And unions looked at that and said, all right, we have the first little bit of legal recognition that we've ever had in this entire country, and we're going to take that and run with it. So In the early 30s, you saw a massive rise in unionism. Then when the National Labor Relations Act got passed in 35, you had official legal recognition for unions and the modern process that we have for legal union representation. And that in part led to the rise of the CIO, or the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was a industrial unionist approach to organizing workers, which meant everyone that works in the same shop is part of the same union. Whereas previously, under the American Federation of Labor, if you had, let's say, like a car shop or a car factory, you'd have a union for the people making the auto body panels. You had a separate union for the tool and die makers that make the dies that cut the panels that are then made into the car. Then you'd have a separate union for the people making the tires. You'd have a separate union for the people making the engines. You'd have a separate union for the people installing the glass. And that's because these are all different specialized trades that would all get brought in together. The CIO recognized that as industrialization progressed, those individual trades are losing more and more of their distinction. And so it makes a lot more sense to just say, all right, you work in a car factory. You're an auto worker. Everyone in this car factory is an auto worker, regardless of what job you do. So CIO came about, actually founded over in Atlantic City, it really started in Atlantic City, then started to spread all across the country very, very quickly. I should say the first CIO union wasn't in Atlantic City. It started in Atlantic City because that's where the American Federation of Labor held their convention. Joe Louis punched the head of the Carpenters Union, stormed out, and then basically went back to his hotel room and founded the CIO. Now, one of the first major CIO-led strikes, or not one of the first, but really one of the most powerful CIO-led strikes among the Jewish working class in Philly, was the 1938 Apex Hosiery strike. So before the CIO came about, this actually goes all the way back to the 19-teens, the American Federation of Full-Fashioned Hosiery Workers, which are people making basically silk stockings, had been organizing on an industrial basis, predominantly in Kensington. The union throughout its entire existence was really focused in Philly, because Philly was one of the centers of the silk trade. So they had they had been organizing across the city, and Apex Hosiery was one of the last major factories that was still unorganized. So in 1938, they went in and brought out, or they went in to organize them, brought them out on a general strike, or brought them out on strike across the entire factory, and initially just surrounded the factory with about 5,000 people. That was, I believe, only a couple hundred of them were actually workers at the factory. Everyone else were various other CIO workers from around the city who came in to show support. So they surrounded the entire factory and eventually broke through the front gate, and about 200 workers occupied the factory for a month. This was one of the CIO's favorite tactics at the time, called a sit-down strike, where rather than bringing or just having everyone come out of the factory and form a wall around it to prevent people from coming in, you go into the factory, occupy it, and physically prevent anyone else from coming in and using the machinery. This got deemed illegal in 1939 because it was very effective. But so Apex Hosiery, the other side to the strike, while they had the occupation of the plant itself, the American Federation of Full-Fashioned Hosiery Workers was also very well known for its social unionism. They were actually instrumental in creating the basis for the social housing policy under the New Deal. They had initially set up a union-owned home called the Karl Mackey Houses, which still exist up in the Northeast. They were named for a striker that got killed by the cops in 1931, if I remember correctly. But they basically set the standard for publicly owned and cooperatively managed housing projects, which then became the model that the New Deal used across the country until they stopped funding any of it and all of them fell into disrepair. But in addition to all of the social housing and those broader social programs that they had, during this strike itself, they basically treated the picket line as both an effective method of denying production, but also as a big party. So there were celebrations and dances out front of the shop. There were performances done inside as well. They had bands, and basically it was just to keep everyone's spirits up while making sure that no production could happen. Strike ended, but the occupation of the plant ended because the mayor and the head of the union came to agreement. The police would not be called on anyone. No one who had occupied the plant would be tried or would be found liable for any damages, and that the state labor board would force arbitration. So everyone occupying the plant marches out under their own free will with a large procession of the owner of the company, the mayor of Philadelphia, and the president of the union at the head. And by the end of the strike, at the end of the summer of '38, basically every single hosiery plant in Philadelphia was organized by AF, American Federation of Full-Fashioned Hosiery Workers. And they had effectively full shop control across the whole city. And we should note that a lot of the workers in these plants were the second generation children of the Yiddish-speaking immigrants that came over in the early 1900s. Now, for the sad part at the end of all of this, because where did all of these radical left-wing Jewish organizations go? So during World War II, there was labor peace enforced by most of both the American Federation of Labor and the CIO, which was basically a no-strike pledge during the war. This also meant that, for the most part, there weren't crackdowns on unions. So they had a very cautious peace going on. But after the war, the CIO led a massive strike wave in 1946. Specifically, as they described it, they were trying to effectively win the peace. That they had, there was an economic downturn, they had a lot of people coming back from the war, and they wanted to make sure that basically all the troops came back to some level of economic prosperity. So that strike wave also came at a time when the Democrat control, or the New Deal Democrat control in Congress, had shifted after the 1944 elections. So they came back to a much less favorable political situation, and immediately faced really stiff opposition from the legislature, to the point where the Hartley-Taft, or Taft-Hartley, as we call it today, bill got passed, which was theoretically an addition to the National Labor Relations Act, but effectively what it did was strip out a lot of the good parts of the NLRA and put a lot more restrictions on labor unions in terms of what they could do, and most notably also put in a requirement that anyone in labor union leadership had to sign a legal affidavit that they were not now, nor were they ever members of the Communist Party. That also tended to get expanded to just anyone with vaguely left-wing beliefs that was in labor union leadership would get effectively forced out of union leadership. And you can't really read that pin, but it says, "I am not now, nor have I ever been a member of HUAC," which is the House Un-American Activities Committee. Because the other side of this was there was also, of course, a broad anti-communist purge led by initially Dees under the Dees Commission, which then turned into the House Un-American Activities Commission under McCarthy. One thing I've skipped over is obviously also the Holocaust happened, which had some impacts. Namely, the American Jewish left had always existed in collaboration with the European Jewish left. If you were a socialist, you would have been in correspondence with Bundists in Poland or other Jewish socialists in England or across Europe. If you were a communist, you'd be in correspondence either directly, depending on the time period, either directly with the Soviet Union or with other Jewish communists when Soviet and Comintern policy allowed Jewish communists to exist as both Jews and communists. The 20s and 30s got really freaking complicated with that. And I will also say the Jewish communist community in the United States was generally allowed a lot more leeway to exist as its own ethnic identity than some of the Jewish communist groups in Europe. So with all of that connection severed, and especially with the Bund and a lot of the radical groups in Eastern Europe destroyed, the American Jewish left was feeling felt they didn't have a lot of support. They were under constant scrutiny by the government. And then in addition to that, you had the uprising of HUAC, which has been described as effectively the federal government's largest anti-Semitic program that they've ever operated. As part of that, you also had wealthy and bourgeois elements of the Jewish community that were finally recognizing an opportunity to rid themselves of kind of this specter of Jewish communism that had always been making it more difficult for them to integrate into Western white society. So they were more than happy to throw all of the working class Jewish organizations under the bus. Then the other side of that is effectively, as part of the federal government's attempt to justify entry into World War II and also kind of save some face in terms of exposing its own fairly virulent strains of anti-Semitism, Jews started to be seen as more white in the late 30s into the 40s. There's a whole lot of things that can be discussed there. But effectively, Jewish service members coming back had access to the GI Bill. For the first time, it was a lot easier for working class Jews to get home loans, to get education, and to move out of the various working class ghettos throughout the city. I don't know if anyone has ever looked at the old redlining maps. I know the neighborhood I'm living in Germantown right now, says that it was of decreasing value because of the influx of Italian and Jewish immigrants. And that was 1934. So basically both Jews and Italians became white in the 40s and were allowed access to some of the finer things in life, which then led to them fleeing the cities and becoming more suburbanized, which also meant that it was more difficult to organize these working class mutual aid organizations, because when you're not all living in the same tenements right next to each other, it's a lot harder to organize a daily mutual aid exchange. And also that just led into broader assimilation into white society, which made it more difficult, or made you more wary of going to a Yiddish speaking or a Yiddish language radical show. So that was truly a whirlwind of explanation on kind of Jewish radicalism in Philadelphia and the East Coast a little bit more largely. There's obviously a lot more on all of these topics to discuss, and even what's covered here is just the very top layer of just what happened in Philly, because there's a lot.